All right. Very quickly, it's a huge pleasure to welcome as our second speaker on this panel my wonderful colleague from upstate New York, Annie Laver from the University of Syracuse. And Annie's paper today is entitled Women Organists at the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. Please welcome Annie Laver.
I brought my fan club with me from Syracuse, you can tell. Some of my students are here. It's great to be with you today, and I'm very pleased to be able to share some of this new research that I've been doing on the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. The U.S.'s great expositions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are fascinating, multi-layered events that provide insight into almost every aspect of society. Modeled on the great international expositions in Europe, these events were designed to tout America's progress and innovation in the areas of science, industry, and culture. Organs were an important feature of expositions because they served dual roles as state-of-the-art machine and musical instrument. Some of our nation's most iconic organs began life as exposition instruments. Many of you will recognize this instrument, Hill Auditorium organ across the way here at the university, that began life as the exposition organ for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It was in the process of writing an article about concert programming at the Chicago event that I began looking at subsequent expositions, in particular, the 1901 Pan American Exposition held in Buffalo, New York. In the handsome pamphlet announcing the Pan American organ concerts, one sentence immediately caught my attention. The notice read, quote, "A special effort has been made to secure a large representation of women organists throughout the United States who have won distinction as performers upon this instrument, and this feature should prove of especial interest," end quote. The Chicago Exposition hosted 21 performers, all of whom were men. The Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, held in 1876, was a less formal performance affair, but records show that only one woman may have been involved. Equity in representation was not a priority for organizers of previous expositions, which raised the question, why the push for inclusion in Buffalo? This presentation will demonstrate that societal factors impacting women in this period, and a particularly open-minded series organizer, resulted in this unprecedented commitment to inclusion. I will also introduce the 7 women organists who performed and comment on how their programming compared to their male counterparts. The ideals behind the Pan American Exposition were similar to other 19th century American fairs. Edification and education were central, as was demonstrating American innovation and showing off the host city. Compared to other major expositions in the US, Buffalo was on the small side. Over the course of the 6 months it was open, from May 1st to November 1st, 1901, the exposition welcomed just over 5 million paying customers, generating close to $2.5 million in revenue. The Pan American Exposition was the first to focus on exhibits from the Western Hemisphere exclusively, first to illuminate the grounds with electric lights each evening, and it was the first to have a daily program of free band and organ concerts in a dedicated music hall. Unfortunately, the event is probably best known in US history as the place where then President McKinley was shot by a Czech anarchist named Leon Czolgosz during a ceremony in the Temple of Music on September 6th. He died in a Buffalo hospital 8 days later, and Theodore Roosevelt assumed the presidency. This tragic event nevertheless provides a segue to the topic of organ music at the Exposition, since rumor has it that the gunshots were fired while the Exposition organist William Gompf was playing the organ. The firm, Emmons Howard of Buffalo, New York, and Westfield, Massachusetts, was engaged to provide a 4-manual, 53-stop organ for the primary music and event space, the 2,200-seat Temple of Music, pictured here. Over the course of the 6 months of the Exposition, over 80 different organists from across the United States and Canada performed over 167 concerts in the Temple of Music. The final report indicated that attendance for these daily concerts averaged 2,500 people, which probably meant that somebody was either exaggerating or that people were coming and going during the recitals, since the hall only sat 2,200. It's still an impressive audience for an organ concert. This event surpassed the organ programs of previous U.S. expositions if we consider the place of privilege in the music program overall, the financial success of the organ concerts, and the overall attendance. The event was also noteworthy if we look at it through the lens of inclusion. The fact that this event engaged 7 women recitalists, one of whom was blind, when all previous expositions had only boasted 1 female performer, the event becomes even more significant. This was a period in which women were absent from the top echelons of academic and church positions and appeared only rarely as concert organists. When they did perform in public, they had to work extra hard to combat ingrained stereotypes that they were not up to playing such a physically challenging instrument. Mary McConnell, one of the Pan American Exposition recitalists, also happened to be music critic for the Buffalo News, and she chose to tackle some of these stereotypes in her July 1901 column, after hearing an audience member's comments about a colleague's exposition recital. She wrote, quote, "To hear the average person talk about organ playing makes one absolutely hopeless as to the possibility of people ever realizing that organ playing is not a question of physical strength and labor. And in these days of electric organs where the touch weighs practically nothing, and pneumatic organs where the touch can be regulated to suit the taste of the performer, the weight of the full organ at the Temple of Music weighs but 4 ounces. Main strength has little to do with the manipulation of an organ. As one of the up-to-date organists visiting here recently said, quote, organ playing is a question of brains, not of strength. But unfortunately for the women organists, the average audience accepts as necessarily good the indifferent work of many men organists, but the women must play doubly well to be appreciated. And then, wonderful of compliments, she plays as well as the men do. It is nearly time that the ears would judge of a musical performance. They are the only competent judges," end quote. Given the infrequent opportunities for women to excel as concert organists and professionals and the prejudice against them in this period, the Pan American Series commitment to inclusion stands in striking contrast to its contemporary context. On the other hand, it also reflected significant societal changes involving women in American musical life, which may help explain why organizers made a special effort to include women in the performance roster. First, this period saw the steady increase in women seeking professional musical training. Music schools were popping up all over the United States in the late 19th century, and as Christine Ammer notes, the majority of students in these schools were girls. Second, not only were women taking advantage of opportunities for musical education at home, more and more were making the trip to Europe, the ultimate finishing school for an American musician. For example, at least 27 female students from the United States traveled to Paris to study with the great organist Alexandre Guilmant over the course of his lifetime. These students returned to the US with legitimacy that they were able to leverage as performers and teachers alongside their male counterparts. Third, more and more women were engaging with music outside the home. Music making had long been an acceptable domestic pursuit for middle and upper class women, but women now began to view music as a vehicle for civic engagement. Women across the country established hundreds of music clubs in this period. The mission of these clubs ranged from fundraising for local opera or orchestra performances, supporting women composers, or providing performance opportunities for its members. Magazines like the Etude reinforced these activities, publishing columns about music clubs titled Women's Work in Music. Fourth, the ongoing struggle for women's suffrage had moved from the political fringes to become a mainstream national issue by 1901. Upstate New York was one of the centers of the women's suffrage struggle, thanks to early local pioneers Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. While organizers of the recent Chicago Exposition adopted a separate and unequal approach to involving women by relegating them to the Women's Congress Auxiliary, Buffalo organizers sought to integrate women more fully, no doubt based in part on the spirit of the times and local activism. All these forces contributed to an environment that offered increased possibilities for women musicians. But it took a particular individual to make representation a cornerstone of the Buffalo organ program. Simon Fleischman, pictured here. In addition to being a lawyer and local politician, Fleischman was an accomplished organist and served as music critic for the Buffalo Courier in the 1880s. Fleischman was the coordinator of the organ series, and it is to his credit that the program made a point of involving women. Perhaps his organist sister, Bianca, encouraged him to seek better representation for women on the program, or maybe he was influenced by his fellow music critic, Mary McConnell. One of the remarkable things about Fleischman's leadership of the series was that it not only embraced inclusion with respect to the performers, but also with respect to the audience. Fleischman was able to convince his colleagues on the Exposition Planning Committee that the Buffalo event should include organ concerts and that they should be offered at no extra charge to Exposition attendees. Fleischman wanted the series to be open and inviting to all. He purposely programmed organ concerts in the late afternoon in order to attract the people who had been at the fair all day and wanted to sit down and rest. He involved a variety of organists from different regions of the United States and Canada, and he produced a handsome 48-page booklet of performer headshots and bios that enjoyed wide circulation across the two nations. At the conclusion of his report to Exposition Director General William Buchanan, Fleischman noted how the planning and promotion contributed to the series' success. Quote, "The recitals illustrated the interest taken in fine organ music on the part of the public when such concerts are made attractive and inviting," end quote. He also commented that the series, quote, "marked a distinct and notable achievement in musical progress and history," end quote. So who were these women, these trailblazers in the progressive era who demonstrated that women could be capable concert organists? I'll spend the next few minutes introducing Mary Chapel Fisher, Emily Lucetta Maynard, Mary Florence McConnell, Gertrude Sanssouci, Fanny M. Spencer, Iona Bush Riddell, and Mrs. P.V.M. Raymond. Mary Chapel Fisher had the most prominent performing profile of this group of women, and as such, she was granted 3 recitals at the Exposition. I'll read the biography printed in the promotional pamphlet to demonstrate the kind of information that was shared with the wider public prior to the recital series. This is her entry. Oops, there. It reads, born December 19th, 1864 in Auburn, New York, and now lives in Rochester, New York. She began her musical education with her father, Newton Chapel, continuing with Isaac V. Flager of Auburn, and later with Garrett Smith, New York, and Alexander Guimont, Paris. She was, for 14 years, organist and choir director at the First Baptist Church, Auburn, and for 5 years, organist at the First Presbyterian Church, Rochester, and was one of the founders of the Guild of American Organists, end quote. Mrs. Chapel Fisher distinguished herself in her field by maintaining a performance profile even after her marriage to Frank Fisher in 1888. There are newspaper records of her performing recitals at various churches in Rochester, as well as churches in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and at Vassar College. She was an advocate for women musicians, publishing articles on the subject in the Etude in 1909. Fisher's repertoire revealed her serious musical training at home and abroad. Her Buffalo programs included substantial solo works by Bach, Guilmant, Widor, and Franck, alongside songs with assisting vocalists, as was the custom for many organ recitals in the period. She was one of only a handful of performers who included compositions by women. These were two songs by British composers, Beloved It Is Morn by Florence Aylward, and The Lord Is My Light by Frances Allotson. In her review of Fisher's performances, Mary McConnell wrote, quote, "Her programs have been very interesting, devoted almost exclusive to genuine organ compositions, and they have been exceptionally well performed. She has ample technique and very good taste in registration," end quote. And we can discuss what she meant by genuine organ compositions later if you like. Before moving on to introduce the other performers on the series, I suggest we take a brief musical interlude that will help us enter into the sound world of this event. I'd like to offer a contemporary recording of Frances Allotson's The Lord Is My Light, a piece that Mary Fisher performed with tenor Robert Kent Parker on her July 27th program. As we look at the programs of other recitalists, you'll see Allotson's name a few more times. She was a successful songwriter who had published a number of patriotic and popular songs by the turn of the century. And I'm going to try to play tenor John McCormack singing the first part of this song, The Lord Is My Light, from his recording with Gramophone Records in 1917. Let's see if this works. Oops. No. Maybe I just close out of this for a second. Well, darn, that worked before. Yeah. Okay, we're not having any luck here, so I'm going to move on. If you have access to Naxos, you can find John McCormack singing The Lord Is My Light. And there's the score for it. Okay, so I'm going to continue with, by introducing Emily Lucetta Maynard, who was born and raised in upstate New York. But at the time of the exposition, she was working as musical director of the School for the Blind in Gary, South Dakota. Maynard's inclusion in the lineup of organists is notable because she was one of only 2 blind organists to perform at a U.S. exposition to date. The other was somebody named C.A.W. Howland, who gave a concert in Chicago. Maynard's programs on August 21st and 22nd notably included a handful of works by American composers. The next woman to perform at the Exposition was the aforementioned Mary Florence McConnell on September 5th. Born in nearby Lockport, she received her advanced musical training in Boston with Samuel B. Whitney and New York with Samuel P. Warren. In addition to her work as musical editor for the Buffalo News, McConnell had served a number of Buffalo area churches and was assistant supervisor of music in the Buffalo Public Schools. McConnell's program opened with the famous Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Bach, which happened to be the most oft performed piece at the Exposition. She also performed pieces by Baptiste, Laver, and of course Guimont, and invited her sister to join her on vocal solos. Gertrude Sans-Souci performed 2 concerts on September 12th and 13th. Born in Connecticut, she spent her early years in St. Paul, Minnesota, before moving with her mother and sister to Berlin, Germany, to study piano and organ. At the time of her engagement in Buffalo, Sans-Souci had become organist at the Catholic Cathedral in St. Paul, was teaching at Northwestern Conservatory of Music, and had published a handful of songs for voice and piano. Sans-Souci had the unfortunate task of performing her 2 concerts in the immediate aftermath of the attack on President McKinley. The president was in intensive care at the Buffalo Hospital at this time, but the fair stayed open as planned. Sans-Souci's concerts notably coincided with a special celebration of women at the Exposition. A public meeting of the National Council of Women with luminaries Susan B. Anthony and Alice Parker in attendance was scheduled for September 12th, and the week had opened with meetings of the National American Women's Suffrage Conference. Sans-Souci's programs included her signature piece, Ludwig Thiele's virtuosic chromatic fantasy in A minor that she learned in Germany, transcriptions of works by Wagner, Chopin, and Grieg, and a much beloved arrangement of The Lost Chord by Arthur Sullivan. Fanny M. Spencer was the next female organist to perform on September 29th and 30th. She was organist at the Presbyterian Church of Dobbs Ferry on the Hudson, composer of sacred music, and another founding member of the AGL. Spencer's Exposition programs included another performance of Thiele's challenging chromatic fantasy and fugue, pieces by Guimont, Widor, Schumann, Bach, and Foote. She also performed transcriptions of familiar works by Rossini, Carl Maria von Weber, and Saint-Saëns. Her September 29th program included an intriguing collaboration with someone described as Carol the Whistler on a song by Strauss. I'd like to know more about that. Iona Bush Riddell was a graduate of the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music and was organist at Central Christian Church in that city. She traveled from her Cincinnati home to perform 2 concerts at the Exposition on October 7th and 8th. Riddell performed organ solos by Hollins, Lamer, and Lemons, and collaborated with a Cincinnati colleague on a number of songs, including Love is a Bubble by Allotson. These 6 recitals were all featured in the promotional booklet circulated in advance of the Exposition. As the fair went on, the schedule continued to be updated and more performers were added to the series, such as Mrs. P.V.M. Raymond of Lincoln, Nebraska. A student of Frederick Archer and Clarence Eddy, she gave a concert on August 17th that included works by Bach, Mendelssohn, and Lemons, as well as another Allotson song, As Pants the Heart. Exposition programs also mention a Mrs. J.S. Marvin, who played a duet on Mr. Riesberg's recital, and a Miss Annie Pete of Racine, Wisconsin, who played short recitals on Wisconsin Day, July 27th, and had the distinction as being, quote, the youngest girl organist in the United States. I will now offer a few brief comments on concert programming as it relates to these performers. This discussion makes use of a newly created database of pieces performed at the Exposition. The Syracuse University Office of Undergraduate Research allowed me to hire Yangtze Austin Shao, who's sitting right in the front there, to help me create this database this past summer. And just wanted to acknowledge Austin because he came to this conference and did such important work to allow me to present the material. What we found was women performers may have made inroads in Buffalo, but the database reveals women composers did not receive the same pride of place. The series on the whole included performances of over 1,500 pieces, but only 14 of these were by women. They're listed here. 12 of these pieces were vocal solos with accompaniment, one of the only really acceptable genres open to women composers in this period. Frances Allitson's songs were performed 7 times, and she was the only woman whose work received more than 2 performances. The 2 instrumental solos by Cecile Chaminade and Kate Vanderpoel were probably arrangements of piano pieces, so works by organ for women were absent from this series. It is significant that 3 female organists were responsible for 4 of the 14 performances of works by women, but this seems to be the extent of women performers advocating for their composer peers on their programs. Instead, women tended to program the kinds of pieces men were playing, namely works by Guilmant, Bach, Laver, and so on. You saw their names. This table of the top 10 composers represented on Pan-American Exposition recital programs includes many of the names we just saw on the women's programs. Thus, women recitalists more or less reflected the norm when it came to programming. Their choices represented their training, their teachers, their preferences, and, I think, the desire to gain legitimacy as performers. Women's programs followed other key trends at the Exposition. The majority of women chose to perform with vocalists, just as the majority of men did. Almost half of the 167 programs at the Exposition included 1 or more collaborations with a soloist or ensemble. And 3/4 of the women's programs included 1 or more transcriptions of either a piano or an orchestral work, a proportion similar to the 2/3 of the total programs that included these pieces. So I'd like to close with this. Looking at this fascinating musical event through the lens of inclusion offers a couple of important takeaways. First, it is only by broadening the study of music to include performers, supporters, organizers, and patrons that we gain a more complete picture of a musical life, one where women played an important role. If our historical focus only stays on the so-called great composers, we have only a limited understanding of this period. Second, women musicians needed, and probably still need, allies in order to gain significant ground. It took a well-respected, well-connected man, Simon Fleischman, to convince his peers of his vision for a music series that was inclusive of women and democratic in its appeal to a wide audience. Throughout history, marginalized groups have achieved some of their largest leaps forward because of an ally from the more socially privileged group. The example of the Pan-American Exposition bears this out. It is an important reminder to those of us today who are in a position to hire colleagues, choose performers for events, or select composers for our concert programs, that we have the power to help shape our current musical life and make it more inclusive and inviting for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie, for a fascinating and very important presentation. I'm sure there are questions. The floor is open. We have a few minutes. Maybe I'll just start while you're composing your ideas by saying that we've been doing a project at Cornell recently on archiving all the organ recital programs from 1875 until, I don't know what we're up to now, probably the 1920s. And Ivy Flagler appears a great deal. Mm-hmm. And you can, it's very, very interesting. The story you tell here chimes really very well with what we're seeing. We have one whole year of one, I can't remember her name, one woman organist who comes very regularly and plays concerts. and the repertoire is kind of very similar. But I think perhaps there's an interesting story to be told about organ culture in upstate New York in this period. Be interesting to know if it has particular aspects that mark it out, even with respect to women, given the history of women's suffrage in the area too. I don't know. Maybe we should collaborate, Annie.
Yeah, we're neighbors.
We are.
I like collaborating with you on that. Yeah, I mean I mentioned this really briefly, but I first became interested in, I mean, I think expositions are just kind of fascinating. I like the Olympics, so they're sort of like the Olympics of the 19th century in a way. Mm-hmm. But I think I was surprised at what I found with this Chicago World's Fair and what people were playing, and how, we tend to think of Franck and Widor, especially if you look at late 19th century, like, Widor as a god when it comes to the kind of compositions that we teach and we play today. But he was almost non-existent on these programs. In Chicago, it was Guillemot all the way. So I think it's a good reminder that our programs reflect our aesthetics. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of useful. Mm-hmm. If you want to look at the databases themselves, I put them up on my website, so you can actually download the Excel file and sort according to what interests you, and see some of these names yourself if you like.
That's great. Yes. Yeah.
I'll just try to speak loudly. I have a bunch of questions, but how long did the kind of exposition culture continue? And did it continue long enough that there were, for example, were there African American or just non-white men organists performing, and did African American women ever make it? Did that exposition culture last long enough? And then, if you're this time, were other kind of musical things featured at American expositions as they were famously at some of the European exhibitions?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start with the first one. I mean, the period that I'm looking at right now, late 19th century, turn of the century into the 20th, is really like the golden age of these types of events. And Crystal Palace starts it off in 1851, and then you've got the great Paris expositions in the late 19th century. After this one comes St. Louis in 1904. That's a huge one, especially for organists, because Guillemot came back. Then there was another one in San Francisco in 1915, then Philadelphia, I think in 1926, Sesquicentennial. After that, it starts to peter out. And I wonder, I don't know I can't speculate yet on the reasons for that. I hope to dive into St. Louis this summer. I suspect it has to do with recorded sound and film, that people don't need necessarily to come to these kind of things to hear music or experience stuff for the first time. They can get that in different ways. But I think also part of the reason why they were so important for the US is like this whole idea of national identity and legitimacy, like trying to show the Europeans that we were up to standard. This was a big part of that. So that relates to that period. So I don't know yet the answer to your question about, did these things ever feature anything but mostly white men and some white women. But I hope to investigate more. And I think the early conventions or gatherings of the American Guild of Organists that was founded in 1896 are also a very rich research topic that somebody can start looking into with respect to programming. What was the other question?
Did it feature kind of non-European musical
Okay,
groups?
yeah. Okay, yeah. So a lot of people have been looking at World's Fairs lately in musicological circles. So there's a great article on the Chicago Fair by Kiri Miller about, the white city music and then all the music on the Midway, like where Scott Joplin was. And all these different tents and things like that. So yes, there's a lot of cool material to dive into there. I would say the bands were especially in Buffalo and then later in St. Louis, were something that Americans were especially proud of and eager to include. Yeah. Yeah, Emery?
Would you say that the 1901 event helped kickstart the inclusion of women in sort of other parts of organ music, so being church musicians, being featured performers, being organ teachers? Like, did that event help put that into motion?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one I hope to be able to answer, but I'm just not ready to yet, because I think it requires going, in the next to the next exposition, the next convention, and cataloging some of the pieces and the composers the way that we've done with this. But I will say, just flipping through the pages of the Etude, this musical magazine that was really popular in the day, and seeing, like, in 1909, 1 month they devoted entirely to women authors and women's performers and women's issues, and that's the one I referenced Mary Fisher, Chapel Fisher, writing for. So I think this event, definitely those two in particular, those two women had some kind of connection, and were able to have the visibility to advocate a little bit more for women musicians. So it'd be interesting to follow them and see what else we could find and see if it made more of an impact beyond that event. It's a great question. I hope to be able to dive deeper into it.
There are, I'm sure, a lot more questions, and you sparked so many ideas, Annie, that we're going to be able to talk about over the next few days, I hope. So let's take this moment to thank Annie Laver,